Hello and welcome everyone to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming. Thank you so much for joining us today with a very special program on Intrepid women. So my name is Alicia and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum in New York City, and I'll be your host today. And just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free, but if you'd like to support us in joining in delivering this content, we encourage you to click on the link in the comments or in the description. So again, feel free to use the chat today to say hello and let us know where you're tuning in from. Let us know if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before. And of course, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them there as well. Now, people often come to our museum to check out our ship. Here it is. We are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier that also served during the Cold War and the Vietnam War. And we have a lot of other cool things like airplanes and helicopters. We have a submarine and even a space shuttle. And at the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum, our mission is to promote awareness and understanding of history, science, and service, to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And we're going to do that today, but through the lens of an often overlooked group of people in air and space history: women. Now, specifically at the Intrepid, throughout its 31 years in service, no women ever served on board. That's just how things were back then. But that said, it is impossible to pass through the ship's decks without encountering the impact of women in some way. Now, first of all, our ship is called the Intrepid. So, does anyone know what that word means? What does it mean to be intrepid? Tell me in the chat if you know. What does intrepid mean? And while you're doing that, let's also rewind a little bit and look at how we got here in the first place. So, women actually do have a very long and often underrepresented history in the American military. In fact, they have served in every major conflict in some capacity from the American Revolution all the way to present day. And many served as nurses. Some went undercover as spies. Some even went undercover as men so that they could fight because women were seen as too delicate or too dainty in order to be able to do something like that at the time. Now, until recently, less than 100 years ago, actually, women's roles were said to be in the domestic sphere, and that means at home. So they were expected to stay there to raise children and cook and clean and sew. Well, in the 1800s, some women decided enough is enough. They wanted to have the same rights as men, the opportunity to vote, of course, and have different types of jobs out in society. And they started off a huge movement. Now, last year, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of one of the accomplishments of that movement, of course, the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave many women the right to vote. But of course, that movement for equality is still going on today. Now, that said, we can certainly say we've come a long, long way since then, and much of that is because of the work of some very intrepid women. So earlier, I asked you to define that word intrepid for me. And yeah, it means brave and strong and fearless. All right. Well, today we are going to focus on some of those very brave, intrepid women in the fields of air and space, which means, of course, we have to start off at the dawn of flight. Now, most people are familiar with the Wright brothers and their historic first flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But after that point, aviation really started to take off north of there. In fact, in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. New York, of course, is where we're located at the Intrepid Museum. Now, it was in that area, in a town called Hammondsport, that a bicycle maker named Glenn Curtis was inspired by them to start putting motors on some of his early glider planes. So this drawing that you see here is one of those creations that he called the June bug. And once the word got out that he was creating these flying contraptions and showing them off, people started to come from all around to learn to fly with him and to see what he was up to. And one of these people was a woman by the name of Blanche Stewart Scott. Now, she soon became known as the tomboy of the air. She was born in 1884 in Rochester, New York, and was an early enthusiast of the automobile. Though bear in mind now, I say automobile quite loosely here, as it was still, the turn of the century. And in 1910, at the age of 26, she had been contracted by a car company to drive across America in a publicity stunt. So, accompanied by a female reporter, Scott drove all the way from New York to California, stopping along the way at a number of the company's dealerships. Now, the trip was a huge success, and she got a ton of money for it. But, all right, why is this important, right? Well, Glenn Curtis heard about her trip and was really impressed, and he offered to give her flying lessons. In fact, she was the only woman to receive instruction directly from him. So on September 3rd, she begins her lessons, and he had put a limiter on the throttle of the airplane to prevent it from going fast enough to actually become airborne while she was taxiing on the ground on her own. But 3 days later, while she was practicing, something happened. Either the limiter moved or a gust of wind blew and it lifted the biplane up 40 feet into the air before then coming back down for a gentle landing. So her flight was very short and more than likely unintentional, but Blanche Stewart Scott is therefore credited as the very first woman to pilot and solo in an airplane in the United States. And it was all by accident. But she ran with it. So she went on to become a professional pilot. She became the first woman to fly at a public event in America. And she became an accomplished stunt pilot known for flying upside down and performing death dives from like 4,000 feet in the air. And then she'd suddenly pull up at just 200 feet from the ground. And she also became the first female test pilot. But she eventually retired from flying after just 6 years because she grew bothered by the public's interest in air crashes and the fact that the aviation industry just didn't allow any opportunities for women to become mechanics or engineers themselves. So by the time she passed away in 1970, she was 79 years old, but she had accomplished quite a bit as a pilot, although she never actually had applied for a pilot's license nor a driver's license. They were still so new at the time that she'd gotten into them that they didn't really even exist yet, so she didn't have to. Now, speaking of licenses, Harriet Quimby was the first woman to actually receive her pilot's license in the United States. In 1903, at the age of 28, she had moved from Michigan to New York City to work as a theater critic and as a journalist. But a few years later, she grew interested in aviation after attending the International Aviation Tournament at Belmont Park on Long Island. So she started to talk about aviation in her articles, and she encouraged flying as a sport for women. And just 1 year later, in 1910, she took her pilot's test and became the first American woman to earn an official Aero Club of America aviator's certificate. Now, Quimby became known as one of the country's few female pilots, and she famously embraced her femininity by wearing a specially made plum-colored flight suit. And she said, if a woman wants to fly, first of all, she must, of course, abandon skirts and don a knickerbocker uniform. Now, that basically means pants. So her famous one-piece hooded purple suit was made of thick woolback satin. And what was amazing about it was that it was actually designed so that it can be converted from pants to a dress just by adjusting the buttons that were down the inner legs. And you can kind of see it in that picture there. So it was convertible fashion way ahead of its time, really. And she famously always wore this flight suit, though. And a few years later, a grape soda company called Vin Fizz, true story, even recruited her as their spokesperson and used her image on their products in her purple aviator uniform for a number of their advertisements. So that's a pretty cool thing there, too. Now, Harriet Quimby also became the first woman to fly across the English Channel. But her accomplishment didn't get much press because, believe it or not, the day before she did it, the Titanic sank. And so, of course, that was all over the press. So people were understandably just a little bit distracted. But sadly, just months later, on July 1st, 1912, she flew in a meet in Boston over the Boston Harbor. But while she was flying at 1,000 feet, the aircraft unexpectedly pitched forward for some reason. And she and her passenger were both thrown from their seats and ended up crashing into the water. So very, very sadly, she had only had her license for 1 year at that point. But, women like Blanche and Harriet were remarkable for their time. You have to remember now, this was a time at the turn of the century where women were facing a number of barriers that made them unable to fly commercially or with the military. And they were also under constant scrutiny, down to everything like what they wore. One famous aviatrix of the time even said, male pilots could look like deep-sea divers or humanoids with braided faces from Mars, and reporters loved it. The eerier, the better. But let one of us women have a hair out of place or a smudge on her nose, and it would be triumphantly hailed coast to coast as a reason for women belonging in the home. That was Elinor Smith, who we'll get to in just a second, too. Now, it was around this time that World War I was happening. And all of the new flying fields that had popped up, particularly out on Long Island, were being converted to training grounds for pilots who were heading overseas to fight. So Glenn Curtiss, the bicycle guy, again, built around 10,000 planes that he called Curtiss Jennies for use in training. And although pretty much every pilot trained on them, none of the planes actually saw any action in Europe because they couldn't fly there. This was so long ago that they weren't technologically sophisticated enough to even fly that long distance across the ocean. So when the pilots were done training, all of the planes that they trained on here and that they stayed here, and then the pilots would fly European planes overseas. Now that of course meant that when the war ended, there were a lot of extra planes left over here. So the government decided to sell them off to private citizens for super cheap, and they were practically giving them away at that point. But this is what kicked off what we now call the golden age of flying. And it was an incredible opportunity for the masses, men and women alike, to learn and to experiment with flight. And the country was then introduced for the very first time to barnstormers and wing walkers and flying circuses. So these are people who performed aviation acrobatics, death-defying stunts. And this was a time where aircraft was really pushed to their limits. So these people would literally hang from planes high above the ground, and they would perform gimmicks like playing tennis and shooting targets or dancing and even jumping from plane to plane while they were up high up in the sky. But it wasn't just former military men who were doing this. There were a number of women who were also barnstormers. For instance, the woman on the bottom there, Catherine Stinson, she was the first woman in the world to perform a loop in an airplane. And then also Pancho Barnes on the top on the right there went on to become a movie stunt pilot and even founded the first Stunt Pilots Union. Now, another incredible woman of the era who began as a famous barnstormer was Bessie Coleman, also known as Queen Bess. Now, she was the first African American woman and first woman of Native American descent to receive her pilot's license. She grew up in Texas. Her father was of Cherokee descent and her mother was African American. And she became interested in flying at a very early age. But this was only peaked when she started to hear of all of the war stories from pilots who were returning home from World War I. Now, at that time, there were no training opportunities for African Americans, nor for Native Americans, nor for women in general. So she took a second job at a chili parlor to save money and then eventually earned scholarships to go to France for flight school. Now, in 1920, she traveled to Paris and she learned to fly in a biplane, just like the one you can see here in this image, similar, again, to the Curtiss Jennies that were flown in the United States. And 1 year later, she earned her pilot's license. But she was quoted as saying, "The air is the only place free from prejudices. I know we, African Americans, had no aviators, neither men nor women. And I knew the race needed to be represented along this most important line. So I thought it my duty to risk my life to learn aviation." She quickly realized, though, that in order to make a living as an aviator, she'd have to become one of these barnstorming stunt flyers and perform those very dangerous tricks. So she took on the name Queen Bess, and she made her very first appearance in an American air show in 1922 at an event that was honoring veterans of the all-black 369th Infantry Regiment of World War I. And the show billed her as the world's greatest woman flyer. Now, Bessie Coleman was known for her kind of flamboyant style and her determination, and she would stop at nothing to complete a difficult stunt. She even once broke a leg and 3 ribs when her plane stalled and crashed. But she was committed to promoting aviation and combating racism as well. So she spoke to audiences across the country about these goals, and she absolutely refused to participate in events that didn't allow the attendance of African Americans as well. She also had always wanted to set up a school for young Black aviators. But sadly, in 1926, at the age of just 34, Coleman passed away in a tragic crash. Now, she had just purchased a poorly maintained plane in Jacksonville, Florida, and had not put on her seatbelt because she was planning a parachute jump for the next day, and she wanted to be able to look over the cockpit to, see the ground below. But about 10 minutes into the flight, the plane unexpectedly went into a spin dive at about 3,000 feet and crashed. But her memory has certainly not been lost. She has since been honored by numerous Hall of Fames, and now posthumously, her name is attached to a number of libraries and schools, just like she always dreamed. So Fearless stunt flyers like Coleman went on to push the boundaries of aviation. They performed demonstrations of planes and air shows. They broke records of all kinds, including our next intrepid woman, Elinor Smith. Now, she was a teenage daredevil and a record breaker who found fame after illegally flying her plane under New York City's 4 East River bridges. Now, Elinor Smith was no stranger to planes. She grew up on Long Island and even took her first flight in a potato patch at the age of 6 years old. But it left a huge impression on her. And after persuading her parents to let her take flying lessons, she made her first solo flight at the age of 15. And then 1 year later, became the youngest licensed pilot in the country at just 16 years old. Well, one day, she was out hanging around the hangars on Long Island when a wandering barnstormer strolled in. Now, he had just had his license revoked for trying to pull a stunt by flying under New York's Hellgate Bridge. And one thing led to another, and a betting pool got formed that she, this plucky, headstrong teenager that she was, that she couldn't do the same. Now, Elinor knew that she could risk losing her license if she took the bet, of course, but on the other hand, she also didn't want to disappoint all of her fans. So she ended up taking the bait, but she upped the ante by aiming to fly under not one, but all 4 of the East River bridges. So all that week, she scoped out the river, she checked out the tides, she checked out the clearances of all of the bridges. And then on Sunday, October 21st, 1928, she climbed into her plane and she headed off towards the East River. So she first flew under the Queensboro Bridge, where she got off to kind of an unexpected start, and she narrowly had to weave her way through a bunch of hanging ropes and weights from construction that was going on up above, a little unexpected. Then, as she passed under the next bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, she noticed that the word must have gotten out about the event because it was lined with a bunch of reporters. So she started to get a little bit nervous that she was going to get in trouble for this, but she kept going. Next up was the Manhattan Bridge, but same thing, even more reporters up there. But at this point, she figured, all right, there's no turning back now. So she actually kind of played to them a little bit. She wobbled her plane side to side to say hello, and she even blew him a kiss. And then finally, she approached the Brooklyn Bridge. But she was actually in for the surprise of her life here because she noticed that there was a tanker and a Navy destroyer that were passing one another directly underneath the bridge. And she was moving so fast at that point and getting so close that she wasn't going to have time to fly around them or even up and over the bridge. So she had to think really quickly. And while she was flying, she decided to flip her plane sideways and flew right in between the 2 ships. So at 17 years old, Elinor Smith became the first and only person to ever fly under all 4 New York City bridges in an incredibly dangerous and incredibly illegal stunt that made her very, very famous. Now, there is one picture of this event, and here it is. This is a picture of her flying under the Williamsburg Bridge, and you can see her plane circled there in red, right there in the center. Now, believe it or not, the city did take pity on her, probably because of her age. Her license was suspended by the mayor of New York, but only for 10 days. And she did receive a reprimand from the Department of Commerce, but in the very same letter was a separate note from the secretary asking her for her autograph. Now, Elinor Smith went on to set a number of early endurance and speed and altitude records, and she was even voted best female pilot in the country in 1930 by her peers, beating out Amelia Earhart. And in 1934, she was also honored by being only the 3rd person and first woman to appear on the Wheaties box that you could see right there on the right. So kind of cool there for her. She later also went on to become a test pilot for airplane manufacturers and the U.S. Air Force. And then decades later, she also got involved with a foundation that was trying to save a World War II aircraft carrier from the scrapyard. Now, that carrier's name, anyone want to hazard a guess? It was, of course, the Intrepid. How cool. Which is, of course, now home to our museum, the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. So we actually have a really neat little connection with Elinor Smith as well. So before I go on, I do want to pause here and see, does anyone have any questions for me? Any questions? What did it take to get a pilot's license back then? Yeah, so today's pilot's license require many, many hours of training, but back in, say, 1910, the applicant had to be at least 18 years old and had to pass three main tests. So Elinor Smith actually got an exception for hers. The three tests were they had to fly without touching the ground for about 3 miles within a course that was about 1,500 feet wide. And they basically had to make figure eights around some posts. And then they also had to make an altitude flight to a minimum of about 150 feet and then successfully land after they've stopped their motor while they were flying. So effectively showing that they could glide the plane into safety. And that was it. They just had to fly straight, do some figure eights, and then stop their plane and glide. Pretty simple stuff, but that's the basics of what you need to fly a plane as a civilian too. Any other questions? Did Elinor Smith know Amelia Earhart? Yes, actually, she did. Amelia Earhart is, of course, the famous female aviator who went missing and they never found her in the 1930s. So at that time, of course, still there weren't a ton of female pilots, but they all did actually hang out together quite a bit because they would always compete against each other at meets. So they were friends. And actually, Elinor and a few others were a little personally worried about her because so much of her story, if you're familiar with Amelia Earhart, was all about publicity and that publicity machine. So her husband, George Putnam, was obsessed with making her famous. So he did everything he could to hype her up, when in actuality, there is actually some speculation that she might not have been the best pilot even. It was a lot of hype. In Elinor Smith's autobiography, she actually mentions that a few of them were very worried because they never saw her practicing flying. And she really wasn't ever up to speed on the gear and whatnot, the technical stuff of the planes. And she also actually had a really awkward encounter where her husband, George Putnam, had asked Elinor to fly as Amelia Earhart under the guise that she was just her mechanic, and then ducked down in the cockpit after they landed so that in the photographs it would look like she had been flying Amelia. So yeah, there's actually some really crazy stuff back then that was going on. But she was a friend of Amelia Earhart. In fact, Amelia came to Elinor right before she married that guy, expressing some concerns. And Elinor said, yeah, well, so then don't marry him. But she ended up doing it anyway. But Amelia was very instrumental in bringing a lot of these women together. She founded an organization called the 99s for female pilots that is actually still around today. So yeah, kind of a cool connection there as well. All right, so everyone, as we move forward now into the 1940s, right, this brought the United States into World War II. And women primarily, took on support roles on the home front, building airplanes and ships for use overseas. I'll actually make this a little bigger so you can maybe read it. Because the construction of warships, like the Intrepid and airplanes and things like that, because they required some very specialized skills, they couldn't really be created in mass the way that some smaller ships were. So looking at the history of the Intrepid, there was a really great example of what happened. This is a newspaper clipping that talks about the creation of the Intrepid back in 1943. Again, it is an aircraft carrier. So for some history, the keel of our ship was actually laid in Newport News, Virginia on December 1st, 1941. And just 6 days later, Pearl Harbor was attacked. And that dragged a number of their male shipyard workers into war. Now, about 400 women were called in to temporarily fill in some of those positions to keep up with wartime needs, a couple of which you can see in the photograph here from that newspaper clipping. And their presence was felt immediately. It was estimated to take 3 years to construct this huge aircraft carrier, but it only actually took 17 months under their very capable hands. Now, just prior to its launch on April 26th, 1943, the USS Intrepid was even christened by a woman. On that picture in the lower right there, that is Helen Smith Hoover, the wife of a Navy admiral, smashing a bottle of champagne against the Intrepid, because that's what you do. So we had an anniversary of that actually just a few days ago. And the other photo on the left was a gift exchange between her and one of the welders from the ship building yards. So these hardworking women who built the planes and the ships, they represent, of course, this Rosie the Riveter persona that's commonly seen on propaganda during this World War II era. They are these women who left their jobs as laundresses and waitresses or office workers to take on some more dangerous and dirty work for war. Now, these conditions were really rough, and many didn't have proper or safe work attire, but it did allow them the opportunity to branch out into the workforce even more, even if they were still only making half as much as the men at that time. But with the manufacturing needs, of course, at an all-time high during the war, even more workers were needed. So the government started targeting middle-class housewives with posters, just like the one you can see on the right here, tugging at their heartstrings. It says, "The more women at work, the sooner we win." So little bribery there. From 1942 to 1944, the government launched a lot of these publicity campaigns to sell the importance of women doing their part for the war effort to meet production demands. And this is really where that Rosie the Riveter campaign was created. So, two popular images of Rosie were painted by Norman Rockwell, of course. So, the first, all the way on the left, you see his Rosie the Riveter painting, which was used for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. You've also, in the center there, have Liberty Girl, Rosie to the rescue. This illustration in the center that shows a young woman carrying the tools of 31 new jobs that American women held at the time. Kind of fun to look at all those items and pick them apart, see how many you can find. So they were, acting as milkmen, as mechanics, conductors, janitors, all sorts of things. But probably the most famous in pop culture today is the "We Can Do It" poster all the way on the right. And that was created by J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Company. And it shows Rosie in her iconic red polka dot bandana flexing her muscle. We can do it. Yes, very popular. And it's actually something that's been adopted quite a bit, even in recent times now in response to the COVID pandemic. Now, here's another interesting fact about the Rosies. Can you name this Rosie? Who is this woman? Take a close look at that face. See if she looks a little familiar to you at all. The hair color might fool you. Any guesses? Let me know in the chat. Who do you think this woman is? Anyone know? Again, the hair color might fool you, and this was when she was a little younger. But kind of a cool story here. Everyone in the chat there, if you said Marilyn Monroe, you would be right. This is none other than the iconic movie star Marilyn Monroe. Now, back then, she went by Norma Jean Doherty. She was only 18, and this was, of course, before she became a mega superstar. But this just goes to show you how everyone pitched in to help out with the war efforts. She worked 10 hours a day for $20 a week at the Radio Plane Company in Burbank, California, building actually basically what we would call drones today. But what's really, really amazing is that the job might have kicked off her illustrious career because she won a $50 war bond after she was chosen as the queen of her company's picnic. So who knows? Maybe being a Rosie actually helped her off with that stardom too. Now, World War II also gave us female test pilots for the first time. So Grumman Aircraft in Bethpage, Long Island also allowed women like Barbara Jane, Elizabeth Hooker, and Teddy Kenyon here the ability to test the capabilities of aircraft in combat. So these women flew bombers and fighter planes, and the company, Grumman, also recognized that women might need a little extra help and a few extra hands as single parents at the time. So they showed their support by creating one of the first wartime nurseries for the children of their workers. Something that is actually still highly prized today in jobs that have that. Now, nearly 400,000 new roles were created within the military reserves as well, outside of traditional work as a nurse, such as the WAVES, which stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, who filled jobs as secretaries, air traffic controllers, and translators, and also the WACs, W-A-C, which is the Women Auxiliary Corps, who worked switchboards and radios and helped to break codes, too. Meanwhile, you also have the WASPs, which stands for the Women Air Service Patrol, also known as the Fly Girls, who flew training exercises and ferried new aircraft and equipment to their final destinations. Now, Jackie Cochran, who headed up the WASPs, was a famous record-breaking aviator who played a very important role in the inclusion of female pilots in the military. But before that, she actually was also a businesswoman. So before taking up competitive flying, she was in the beauty industry. And some of the most successful products of her cosmetics line, Wings to Beauty, had actually been developed for the dry skin and chapped lips that aviators often encountered while they were flying. Very smart businesswoman. So one of her most unique products was called the Perk Up Stick. It contained 5 beauty products. There was a cleansing cream, a rouge, a night cream, a foundation cream, and a powder. And they were all in a small cylindrical little tube, kind of like a lipstick tube. And you can actually see her holding up that perk up stick in the bottom picture there. Really, really smart woman there. So Jackie Cochran was born Bessie Lee Pittman. She was the youngest of 5 children in a very, very poor family in Florida. They moved from town to town, setting up and reworking sawmills. And at the age of just 14 years old, she married a man named Robert Cochran, gave birth to a son, Robert Jr., who sadly died at only 5 years old. But after the marriage ended a few years later, she decided to keep the name Cochran and begin this new life, began using the name Jacqueline or Jackie as her given name. And she became a hairdresser and eventually wound up in New York City, where she was able to get a job at a very prestigious salon at Saks Fifth Avenue. Well, one day in the early 30s, a friend offered her a ride in an aircraft just for fun, but it really left a huge impact on her. And Cochran then began taking flying lessons at Roosevelt Airfield on Long Island. She learned to fly in just 3 weeks, and within 2 years, she obtained her commercial pilot's license and went on to be a very large proponent for the inclusion of women in air races. Now, in 1937, she set a new women's world speed record, in earning her the nickname the Speed Queen. And just 1 year later, she was considered the best female pilot in the whole of the United States. Now, in the years leading up to World War II, she was part of something called Wings for Britain, which was an organization that ferried American-built aircraft over to England, which also allowed her to become the first woman to fly a bomber across the Atlantic. So again, this wasn't World War I where we had to leave our planes at home and then go fly the European ones. Now we were actually shuttling our planes, and they needed people to do that. But knowing how important that work was, Cochran wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, encouraging her to start a women's flying division in the Army Air Forces, because she felt that qualified women pilots could at least do all of the domestic, the non-combat aviation jobs that were needed to free up more male pilots for combat. Well, eventually, the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the WFTD, opened up, headed by none other than Cochran. And in 1943, they merged with the WAFs, W-A-F, the Women's Air Force Service, to become the WASPs, W-A-S-P-S. And as their director, she supervised the training of hundreds of women pilots throughout World War II and was quite possibly the very first woman pilot in the United States Air Force as well. Now, post-war, she continued to set records like speed and distance and altitude, and most famously became the first woman pilot to go supersonic. So that means faster than the speed of sound. And that was in 1953, while she was setting a world speed record of 652 miles per hour. Now, more fitting for us here at the Intrepid, she was also the first woman to land and take off from an aircraft carrier. So very cool as well. As well as the first woman to make a blind instrument landing, meaning that she couldn't see and that could only use her equipment in order to do so. This was more of kind of a stunt thing that they would do. But that was also something that was very, very daring and very brave. She was also the first pilot to fly above 20,000 feet with an oxygen mask. And in 1960, she even flew the Goodyear blimp. So she still holds more distance and speed records than any pilot, living or dead, male or female. Now, World War II also opened the doors for a few female air and space engineers, like Mary Golda Ross, who became the first Native American aerospace engineer. She began her career at the aerospace company Lockheed during World War II. And at the time, women engineers were extremely, extremely rare. In fact, she was the only one in her whole division, but she ended up staying on the job for over 30 years and eventually helped out with the early years of the space program, too. But she had grown up in a small town in Oklahoma and was the great-granddaughter of a Cherokee Nation chief. She also just loved math and science and eventually became a teacher before moving to California to work for Lockheed on a number of top secret projects, including the spy plane, the SR-71, as well as some of the earliest designs for NASA's rockets and plans for space travel, too. All right, so this leads us to another era now, which is the space age here. But before I move on to that, I want to pause again and see if we have any more questions before we move on. Is Rosie the Riveter a real person? So, the idea of Rosie the Riveter applies kind of to any woman who worked in a factory job during World War II. So, there are a number of questions as to who might have been the original Rosie the Riveter, right? Who is that Rosie? There are a few women who might have been suggested for it. One of them worked in a Navy machine shop and was actually photographed wearing a polka dot bandana, just like in those images. Another was actually a riveter named Rosie, who was at a bomb plant. So there are a few, but the idea behind Rosie the Riveter as a persona in general isn't really meant to be about one person. It's meant to be very inclusive of just every woman who pitched in towards that effort. So they actually still don't know who the one is, if it was even one at all. Any other questions? How many women went to work in factories during World War II? So overall, they estimate that over 6 million women joined the workforce by the end of the war. And at their peak, they made up almost 37% of the workforce. So specifically in defense, the percentage went up something crazy like 500% from the start to the end of the war, because it was important. You know, they had to make the planes and the bombs and stuff because all the guys were overseas. But what's even cooler is that there are records saying that they enjoyed it. After the war ended, over 80% of them wanted to keep their jobs because unfortunately they didn't get to because, of course, all those soldiers were coming back home. But this was a time when it was a really, really huge step in proving that they were capable of doing this type of work. And it really did lay more of the groundwork for the future where they were invited to be part of these types of jobs as well. Great questions. All right, now everyone, finally, we are moving into the space age, all right, and the growing momentum of the civil rights movement of the 1960s as well. So this period coincided with the Cold War, which was a time when the United States found itself in a very tense space race with the Soviet Union in order to get to the moon first. If you've tuned into one of our other programs, you've probably heard that before. We did play a very important role, of course, in the space race, picking up space capsules. But while most people working in the space industry at the time were men, there were certainly still a few women too, like Mary Golda Ross, who we just talked about, who had been inspired by those before her too during the war. So a few other engineers and mathematicians at NASA at the time were women like Dorothy Vaughan and Katherine Johnson, who actually Katherine Johnson's there on the left, the African-American human computers at NASA, made famous, of course, by the movie Hidden Figures. Their calculations of orbital mechanics were essential to the success of our early space flights. You've also got on the right Margaret Hamilton, who helped to develop the onboard flight software for NASA's Apollo program, which she is actually standing next to in that photograph. They used a lot of paper back then. I love that picture. It's literally as tall as her. But another wonderful example of what women were still up against can be seen in the bar which had been set in the selection of astronauts. So during the space race, the Soviet Union was beating us to everything. They got the first satellite in space, Sputnik, right? They got the first animal in space, like the dog, and even the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. And they were just beating us just a little bit every single time. The United States was so close behind, but they kept getting beaten, just even by days, sometimes even on some of those very specific achievements. Now, one of these events was getting the first woman into space. There had been some rumors of women in the Soviet space program, but NASA was very, very strict on their astronaut qualifications. And here they are. So in order to be an astronaut, you had to be under 40 years of age and in excellent physical condition. You had to have a height of 5 feet 11 inches or less. You had to hold a bachelor's degree or the equivalent in a science or engineering field, and to be a qualified jet pilot with at least 1,500 hours of flight time. So just out of curiosity, do any of you who are tuning in right now qualify as a Mercury astronaut? Let me know in the chat. I'm always curious to know. But while the majority of these qualifications could be accomplished by either sex, that last one, jet pilot experience, could only be achieved by men at the time because the military barred women from official military pilot training until the 1970s. So, while not saying it outright, this qualification actually barred all women from meeting even the minimum requirements, which was frustrating. So, of course, in 1959, the initial 7 Mercury astronauts were selected. It made people start to think, though, about the qualifications a little bit. And a popular magazine decided to ask this question: why not a woman? Might they just be as capable as a man, right? So they invited champion aviator and race car driver Betty Skelton to be the very first woman to undergo the Mercury project's testing protocol at NASA for an article. And they thought she might be a perfect candidate because of her very relevant flight experience. And over a period of 4 months, she traveled across the country to meet with the Mercury team, as well as Soviet space scientists. They were kind of still working together a bit. And she braved a very intense testing regimen alongside the Mercury 7 themselves. And they were actually so impressed by her flying record and her skills that they gave her the honorary nickname 7.5. Now, many of the experiments that she underwent tested the limits of what the human body could withstand. And you have to remember, going into space is not a walk on the beach, right? Here on Earth, it is a little different. So, in addition to a physical examination, she also had to perform over 80 tests, including some that involved swallowing a tube to monitor digestion, injecting dye to measure liver absorption rates, monitoring how fast her hand closed when they were shocking her with electricity, also a vertigo test that involved squirting freezing water into her ear. She sat in a sensory deprivation chamber for hours to test her responses to isolation. She walked on a treadmill that gradually got steeper and faster while testing her lung capacity. She endured extreme heat and cold, and she worked underwater to study disorientation in near weightlessness to simulate space. And also, actually, fun fact, she couldn't swim. So that was interesting for her as well. But throughout this process, she also noticed that the astronauts and the scientists would say or do things that made her realize they really weren't interested or prepared to seriously consider women as astronauts at the time. There was one test where the administrators couldn't figure out what she should wear while she was lying on a tilting platform that you can see in that picture there on the left. And at first they recommended, oh, we'll just put her in a hospital gown. But then they thought better of it once they realized the table went upside down with her feet in the air. So instead, they gave her whatever they had on hand, which was a pair of oversized men's pajamas. So there she is in those pajamas. Now, even though the magazine article was a bit of a publicity stunt, and she knew that, Betty Skelton did take it very seriously because she felt very strongly that women were just as capable as men. And she was right. The article called her a petite example of the anatomical fact that women have more brains and stamina per pound than men. So she did pretty well. But this fueled some public interest. And a number of other women pilots became interested in becoming astronauts, which sparked a whole other fascinating experiment on 13 women who are now referred to as the Mercury 13. And you can see all those pictures here. The doctor who had originally developed the Mercury program's testing protocol for NASA set up his own privately funded program for women. And he even said it might be more practical from an engineering standpoint to send women into space over men because they generally weighed less, so they'd require less fuel to get them up into space, and they would also need less oxygen in order to survive. So during his test, one participant, Jerry Cobb, you can actually see that big picture on the right, she even passed in the top 2% of all participants to ever take the test, astronaut men included. So the evidence was becoming pretty clear that women were qualified. But this really scared NASA, who was already feeling the pressure to succeed in the space race, didn't want anything to go wrong or to distract them from that goal. They were already really behind, of course, at this point in 1963. So they had the program shut down. Now, of course, the ladies were very upset. So much so that they met with the president. One of the women was the wife of a senator, so it was able to hook that up. And they also took part in congressional hearings in order to get women to go into space. And in those hearings, John Glenn himself, the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth, even testified against them and said, quote, "It is just a fact. The men go off and fight the wars and fly the airplanes and come back home and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order." Now, that might be frustrating and maybe a little surprising to hear today. John Glenn is, of course, one of our national heroes, and even he wouldn't back them up at that time. So today, there are so many incredible women doing all of these things, of course, that he described, but back then, they simply weren't allowed. So sadly, nothing ever came of their fight. And so 1 year later in 1963, there we go, the Soviet Union beat us yet again and sent the first woman into space. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a giant accomplishment for women worldwide, but as you can imagine, also an incredible disappointment for all of those women who had tried so hard to encourage NASA to change their policies and to give women a chance. And even more frustrating is the fact that it would be another 20 years after that before America got their first female astronaut into space, Sally Ride. Now, in the 60s, it really propelled the women's rights movement. All right. This was a time where that movement was really getting pushed forward. And eventually, when the space shuttle program was launched in 1976, NASA finally began to encourage women to apply as astronaut candidates. So, 6 women were selected in that first class, including Sally Ride on the left here, who also became the first American female astronaut in space in 1983. She had applied after seeing an advertisement in the Stanford student newspaper where she attended, and she was one of only 35 people selected out of the 8,000 applications. Now, as could be expected, before her first historic flight, the media was all over her because of her gender. She was asked very silly questions like, will the flight affect your reproductive organs? And do you cry on the job? NASA even consulted her about putting together a makeup kit for space, which she reminded them that, of course, that is completely unnecessary. And one talk show host even joked that the shuttle flight would be delayed because Dr. Sally Ride had to find a purse to match her shoes. Very sad. So we had come so far and yet still had so much further to go in 1983. But regardless, Sally Ride made history in 83, 20 years after Valentina Tereshkova took women into space. And she has paved the way for women in space ever since. Now, as of today, 82 other women have also become astronauts. Of particular note, Dr. Mae Jemison became the first African American female astronaut in 1992. A year later, Ellen Okoa became the first Hispanic woman in space. Then a year after that, Chiaki Mukai became the first Japanese woman in space. And in 1997, Kalpana Kala became the first woman of Indian origin in space, too. Eileen Collins also became the first woman to both pilot and later command a space shuttle mission. There she is on the left. And in 2019, we also had the first all-female spacewalk, where Christina Koch and Jessica Meir, who are the two in blue furthest on the right there, left the International Space Station together to do some routine maintenance. And of course, coming up in 2024, the Artemis missions are going to send our first woman and next man all the way to the moon. So as you can see, even though historically they haven't frequently been highlighted, these intrepid women have played an important role in air and space history through their hard work and their ideas, and they've really helped to pave the way for the rights and opportunities that are available for the women of today and of tomorrow. There are, of course, countless others who deserve to be celebrated, but we really do feel honored to be able to feature even just a few and to bring their stories to light. So I do want to see if we have any other final questions as we round out the program today. Any last burning questions at all? Did any of the women who did the astronaut test get to go into space? So no, actually, very sadly, they were all really, really qualified, but unfortunately, again, it just wasn't the right time. Many have passed away since then, but back when they were still launching in the space shuttles, they actually invited the Mercury 13 to NASA to watch the launches from time to time. And they actually were also all there when Eileen Collins became the first woman to pilot the shuttle. So I know they definitely followed the program, but no, unfortunately, they never actually got to go up into space and become astronauts after all. All right, let me ask questions. How can I become an astronaut today? Wonderful. All right. So astronaut requirements have changed quite a bit since those early days of the Mercury program. Today, to be an astronaut, you have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to possess a master's degree in a STEM field, so something like science or math or engineering. You have to have at least 2 years of related professional experience or at least 1,000 hours of flight time in a jet. But of course, now men or women can fly jets. You have to also be able to pass the NASA long duration flight astronaut physical. So it's not quite as extreme as it was back then that we talked about with Betty Skelton or the Mercury 13, but it is still pretty rigorous. And also they say you have to have skills in leadership, teamwork, and communications. So then after you've applied and hopefully you've met all of those conditions, NASA will review your application, and then they invite a very small group of only the most highly qualified candidates in for interviews. And then about half of those are invited back for a second interview. And then from that group, they select the new candidates. And then if you get selected there, you then spend the next 2 years learning basic astronaut skills like spacewalking, and you have to, learn how to move around the space station. They've got that neutral buoyancy lab where everything's underwater, that ISS is underwater, and you have to practice doing all of your tools and everything while you're under the water. Flying jet planes, controlling the robotic arm, all of these fun things that, maybe you might do at space camp if you ever went. And then once you've done all that, maybe you'll get picked to actually go up on a mission. So it is a lot of long, hard work, a lot of preparation that goes into it. But they really want to make sure you're prepared, because going into space is tough. It's different than here on Earth for sure. And it's very important work that we are looking into as we progress going to the moon. We'll be setting up a base there to be then eventually launching to even explore Mars in the future. So maybe some of you out there are interested in becoming an astronaut. Maybe you are our next generation. Maybe you will be the first woman or man to set foot on Mars someday. So study hard and apply if the time is right. All right, my friends. Well, if you have any other questions about our programs, feel free to reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through our social media. I want to thank you all so much for watching and sharing your questions and comments with me today. As you know, the museum has a number of new live streams just like this, so please do follow and subscribe to this channel or visit our website for the latest streaming schedule. And if you're able, your donations of any amount do help keep our programs free or low cost, and we encourage you to explore becoming a member as well of our museum online. So everyone, our museum, I just do want to plug too, is now open. We are open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 to 5. So if you're in the area, do come by and check it out. And our next program will be on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. So be sure to come by and check that out. We'll be doing lots of fun new programming on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the future too. All right. So thank you once again for joining us today. Hopefully we will see you on an upcoming program, everyone. All right. See you next time. Bye.